The most important thing is to create a company where people feel like they're connected to some higher purpose, that whether they're banging out lines of code or writing press releases or doing social media management or responding to customer service inquiries, like whatever it is that they do at that company, you want them to understand why what they do is important and why it ladders up to some higher mission, some higher goal. So Zillow is not just, if you're in accounts payable at Zillow and you're paying invoices for them, that's not really what you're doing. You're really trying to create some higher purpose where you're empowering people with access to information so they can make smarter decisions. If you work at Pacaso, you're trying to help the thousands and thousands of Pacaso customers live a more enriched life, have access to a second home that they never thought they could afford, and create memories there with friends and family that they never thought they could have before. And you play a part in creating that opportunity for your customers. So creating a mission orientation is the most important thing.
Awesome. I'm live with Spencer Rascoff, co-founder and chair of Pacaso, heyLibby, Recon Food, dot.LA, 75 and Sunny Ventures. You keep yourself busy, Spencer. So I'm sure there's a couple that I missed, but I appreciate you carving out time to be with us today.
Thanks, John. It sounds like I have career ADD when you describe it that way, but it's great to be here and excited to have a conversation with you.
Likewise. So speaking of career ADD, I think people know you for your time in PropTech, as well as Hotwire that you founded before then that was sold to Expedia. Can you tell us a little bit about your involvement in real estate tech and then where you see the next big innovation happening in real estate tech?
Yeah, absolutely. So, what I do today, after I left Zillow about 3 years ago, is that I invest through 75 and Sunny Ventures, which is my family office venture fund. And I'm an investor in about 25 PropTech companies and about 50 other startups that are not in PropTech. And some of the PropTech companies are Arrived Homes, Avenue 8, Side, Radius Agent, Tomo, Doma, Aloft, La House, Properly, and a number of others. And then I also incubate startups. And so I helped incubate and co-found Pacaso, which is a Series C stage startup that helps fractionalize luxury second homes. And I'm working on another PropTech startup in the software space, et cetera. The common thread that unites those different initiatives in PropTech for me is usually around some form of democratization of real estate, whether it's second home ownership in the case of Pacaso, or empowering the real estate agent more at the expense of the brokerage in the case of Avenue 8 and Radius Agent, or providing information transparency in the case of Nomad Homes, which is a leading European and Middle Eastern real estate brokerage and website information business. So for me, it's mostly about just trying to empower people and help them achieve greater information transparency or greater empowerment when making decisions about real estate related transactions, which is such a huge part of GDP and a huge part of people's individual financial lives.
Speaking of Zillow, have you watched the SNL skit on it? And what are your thoughts on it?
I have. It's amazing. It was, I co-founded the company more than almost 20 years ago, and I was CEO there for, I think, almost 10 or 15 years. And, the SNL skit was really, it was organic, meaning that the Zillow team didn't pay for it. In fact, the Zillow team didn't even know about it ahead of time, but it was not surprising. It was the culmination of 15 years of hard work of building a brand that stood for both real estate shopping, but also frivolity and voyeurism and fun. And a lot of hard work went into building that brand and creating a product that we had this huge payoff of the SNL skit. So it was very rewarding, even though I wasn't there anymore at the time of the SNL skit. It was, I'm really proud of it. It was definitely.
And I will say, I'll post in the show notes after when we publish the podcast. I will say I'm guilty of doing that in bed, me and my wife as well.
For sure.
Very cool. So to think about now what you're doing with your family office with 75 Ventures as a startup studio and investing in these companies, given the macro trends right now in the economy, how are you seeing venture capital change, and how are you responding to those changes and those constrictions in the market?
Well, it's a pretty crappy time for prop tech, and it's a pretty crappy time for venture investing. So when you layer those two things on top of each other, it's not great. Um, First, let me describe why I say it's a challenging time, and then I'll try to paint a bit of a silver lining. So in prop tech, obviously, as mortgage rates have gone up from 3% to 8%, there's been a real standstill in the real estate market. Sellers are reluctant to list their home because they don't want to give up their 8% mortgage and have it switch. Sorry, their 3% mortgage and have it switch to an 8% mortgage. Buyers feel very poor because they can't afford, homes at such a high mortgage rate or a 40-year low of affordability. So as a result, there are very few real estate transactions happening. So the real estate market is sort of at a standstill, and that impacts really everything in and around prop tech. What's happening in the general venture environment is also pretty bad. And again, as rates have gone up, not mortgage rates, but interest rates have gone up, there's been sort of a risk off perspective where VCs are less likely to invest in early stage startups. The valuations of big tech companies and small and medium tech companies have come down as rates have gone up. And that's pulled down the comparable companies, which has impacted startups like yours and startups like the ones that I invested in, the ones that I start. So it's a challenging time, and it's not the good old days from a year or two ago. The silver lining of all of this is when great companies get built. And we've seen this through lots of down cycles. This is when companies like Hotwire or Google or Expedia were built in the wake of the 2001 bubble bursting. It's like how companies like Zillow were built in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. And we're going to see it again, where the companies that are able to weather this storm and get to the other side do incredibly well for two reasons. Number one, they're really fit as companies because they have to be well run to survive. And number two, the competitive landscape is a lot weaker because if it's hard for you, just think how much harder it is for the next company behind you in line, that's just coming up behind you. So in a lot of ways, the door is sort of slammed shut behind this vintage, this cohort of companies that are being built today. And that will benefit them. Those that survive will do really well by comparison. So for founders, hang in there, get to the other side of this, and just know that if it's hard for you, it's probably even harder for everybody else.
Yeah. Given some of the market constrictions and impacting specific spaces like real estate a little bit more heavily, where are you looking? Obviously, a lot of people are talking about AI. What else in the market is exciting you right now?
Well, I'll start with even something more mundane than AI or any other tech revolutions, which is just companies with longer runways. It used to be a pretty good rule of thumb that as a startup, they would need to start raising around maybe when they had 6 to 12 months of cash left. And even at 6 months of cash left, that's okay, no big deal. We can get a round done in the next month or two, and we'll be okay. Well, that's not the reality anymore. The reality today is that it can take 6 or more months to get a round done. And so companies with fewer than 12 months are really in trouble. And I advise most of my companies to try to have 24 months of cash or more. So we're seeing a lot of restructuring rounds being done, down rounds and other rounds with structure. And I'm trying to focus my time and my capital on the companies that I think are going to survive this downturn. And those are the ones that are closer to profitability or already are profitable, and those that have good cash cushion, good runways of ideally 12, at least 12, but ideally 18 to 24 months. With respect to technology, there's no...
Spencer, sorry to pause there for a sec, because I think when I did research, I saw that you all, during the days of Hotwire, had to raise during a down round. And I'm curious, as you think about down rounds, what would be your advice to other entrepreneurs as they are, they have to make those types of hard decisions that could dilute them further, versus try to run the company profitably? How do you think about that now?
Yeah, I mean, down rounds in and of themselves are not tragic. I mean, a down round just means raising a round at a valuation lower than the prior one. The real issue becomes if there's a lot of structure in it. And if the common equity gets wiped out or diluted, or if there's some pay-to-play structure, which makes it really hard for prior investors. I think what you're alluding to is Hotwire started in 1999, and when we did a round in 2001 after 9/11 during the travel recession, we had to do a round with a lot of structure, which really wiped out a lot of the common equity in the company. And when we sold the company just 2 years later for almost $700 million, it was a good return for the preferred investors, the VCs, but it was not a good return for employees that had common equity. So at the time, I was a first time founder, and I don't think I fully understood a lot of the specifics of structure, of what terms like liquidation preference meant, or ratchet, or preferred versus common. I mean, things that I, as a repeat founder today, understand. I was pretty naive to back then. And the advice that I would give to founders is get a good lawyer or get smart on these topics. There are a lot more resources available today than there were back in the early 2000s, 20 something years ago. Today, you can listen to podcasts, read books, read articles. You have ChatGPT, et cetera. There are a lot of great resources to help guide you through these types of things. But the best thing to do is try to avoid all of this and make sure that you're fit as a company and that you cut to survive. Unfortunately, it's not as much fun as being in growth mode. But the best piece of advice that I'm trying to give to companies, and I've been very vocal about this on LinkedIn and Twitter and elsewhere, is that companies need to be right sized for their current revenue base. And in the case of Pacaso, for example, unfortunately, we had to reduce the size of the team. In the case of Zillow, we had layoffs in 2008. In the case of Hotwire, we had layoffs in 2001. So layoffs are very difficult, but unfortunately, they can be an important part of how a company survives downturns.
Totally. And now maybe zooming out as around the industries or spaces that you're particularly excited about. I think I saw that you spoke with the founder of Culver City-based startup Apex, which focuses on small satellites. What's your involvement in companies like that?
So 75 and Sunny has a really diverse portfolio. We already talked about how about a quarter of it is in PropTech. About a quarter of it is in your space, in June's space, which is future of work, HR tech. And I'm an investor in a lot of companies in that space, because when I was running Zillow, I understood how important people and culture were to the company's success. And so I invest in software companies that help try to create scalable people and culture solutions. I think, unfortunately, a lot of companies pull back from spending in that space during recessions and downturns and when their employee base is contracting, which is, of course, exactly the wrong thing to do. That's when companies should be investing more in software solutions and scalable products like June that help build people and culture during these challenging times. But that's not how most companies react. Anyway, that's about a quarter of our portfolio. Then another quarter is, you could sort of call it creator economy, but it's broader than that. It's basically where Silicon Valley meets Hollywood. So things around future of media, digital media, social media. And that's an area that I've incubated a couple companies that I'm really interested in and excited about. And then that last quarter is just other stuff I find interesting and cool. And there's a lot of space in there, including Apex, which is an LA startup, Relativity Space, which I'm an investor in, which is an LA startup, SpaceX,
nice,
which is also an LA-based startup, obviously, that I'm in. So I have a lot of space, some robotics, some AI, and just a variety of other kind of hodgepodge of future.
Yeah, I pulled it up right now. Our head of customer success, her boyfriend works at Relativity. And then we share an investor with Syndio and the HR tech space. And then I know All Voices is another great HR tech company.
Also here in LA.
Here. Yeah. Very cool. You've covered the rise of niche marketplaces like Goat. I think you're an investor there as well.
I'm actually not an investor in Goat. I'm very good friends with Eddie. It's a bit of a sore subject because I never had the opportunity to invest early on. but I love the company. I'm a big fan of his and of theirs. And I've had them on my podcast, et cetera, but I'm not actually an investor in Goat.
I think I saw you cover Goat, and some other niche marketplaces on .LA. Are there any other spaces, and given what you've done at Zillow, are there any other spaces or verticals that you haven't seen the marketplace dynamic apply to yet that you're thinking about?
I have a lot of marketplace businesses. I mean, Hotwire was a marketplace business. You've got travelers on one side and the airlines and hotels on the other. Zillow is a marketplace business with consumers on one side and real estate agents on the other. Um, I've invested in a lot of marketplace businesses. Um, where I'm one area that I'm really light in relative to the total addressable market or the TAM is healthcare. I am an investor in one or two companies. One's called Verta Health, which was founded by Sami Inakin. He was the co-founder of Trulia, which merged with Zillow, and he built a great business at Trulia that I was very fortunate to be able to acquire and help grow. And when he started that business, I was a very early investor. But other than that, I haven't done a lot in health. I am in one other health business called Topography Health, which I think is an LA business, if I remember correctly. And that's a two-sided marketplace for doctors, or well, not really doctors, really clinicians and pharma companies that are doing research on one side, and then patients that are willing to be in patient trials on the other. So that's a two-sided marketplace in healthcare. But in general, I just haven't done that much in that space.
Given the fair share of success that you've had, founding companies, investing in companies, I'm curious, and what you just mentioned about health, how do you think about investing in your own health?
That's an excellent question. I am I've always been, pretty good, pretty healthy. I mean, I was a runner when I was younger, and I still run a decent amount. But I'm now in my late 40s, and in the last couple of years, I've gotten a lot more serious about it. When my dad passed away a couple of years ago, and other family members started to pass away, I've become very focused on health and longevity. I eat well, or at least better than I used to. I exercise every day. I get plenty of sleep. That's a big change. And actually, if you go back and read things that I wrote 10 years ago or interviews that I did 10 years ago, I was one of those kind of macho tech bro people who was like, oh, I sleep 4 hours a day because, I work so hard, blah, blah, blah. And like, no, not anymore. That's actually terrible for longevity. And so I've completely changed my perspective on sleep. Um, uh, and I drink a green juice almost every day. If you follow me on Recon Food, which is my food social network, you'll see lots of hashtag green juice in my food community. So I'm a lot more interested in health and longevity than I used to, and I'm doing a lot more to care for myself than I used to.
I love that. And you've talked a lot about culture. I think one of the things that I saw that you read is that investors are also now keenly interested in company culture. How do you think a strong culture translates to business success, and what metrics can companies use to measure the health of their culture?
Yeah, so this is one of the most positive changes I've seen in investing, both in public companies and in private companies in the last 5 or 10 years. I remember 5 or 10 years ago when I would talk on earnings calls about Zillow winning some best place to work award or a CEO approval rating in Glassdoor, and hedge funds would be like, what? Like, who cares? Like, tell me about EPS, tell me about cash flow, tell me about the, guidance for next quarter. No more. Now investors get it. VCs get it when looking at private companies. Public investors get it when looking at public companies, and that's a good development. Metrics that outside investors can look at when evaluating. There are a lot. You can look at CEO approval ratings on Glassdoor is probably the simplest metric. You can look at employee recognition awards, best places to work awards at local papers or digital media businesses that put out those accolades. You can read things on Blind and on Glassdoor. Those are both great resources. Read reviews. There's actually a ton of great information for investors there. If you want to know how a company's performing, look at what salespeople are posting on Glassdoor or Blind, and you can get great insight into the inner workings of companies. There's some stuff on Twitter also in that regard. The reason it's important is sort of obvious, but great people, properly motivated, build great products that create a lot of revenue and profit and create shareholder value. And so it all starts with great people and proper motivation. And in a remote world or a hybrid world where people are working remotely or part of the time or perhaps all the time remotely, that's even more important and more difficult to create a culture of highly engaged employees because it's so easy to coast when you're working remotely. It's so easy for somebody to work 50%, 60%, 70%, or 10 or 20%. I mean, during quarantine, I know of lots of people that worked at big companies, big tech companies that had two jobs that were working on startups on the side and also collecting their six-figure salary at a big company. And I'm sure it's still happening today, probably a little bit less so than it was then. But I mean, just think about the hit to a company's productivity and value creation when you've got unengaged employees. So it was super important 5 or 10 years ago. It's 10 times more important today when companies are just trying to get employees to engage and to stay highly engaged and also retain.
How have you applied that to the companies that you've started on your own? How do you make sure that that engagement is there?
The most important thing is to create a mission orientation, to try to create a company where people feel like they're connected to some higher purpose, that whether they're banging out lines of code or writing press releases or doing social media management or responding to customer service inquiries, like whatever it is that they do at that company, paying bills for the company and finance, whatever it is, you want them to understand why what they do is important and why it ladders up to some higher mission, some higher goal. So Zillow is not just if you're in accounts payable at Zillow and you're paying invoices for them, that's not really what you're doing. You're really trying to create some higher purpose where you're empowering people with access to information so they can make smarter decisions. If you work at Pacaso, you're trying to help the thousands and thousands of Pacaso customers live a more enriched life, have access to a second home that they never thought they could afford, and create memories there with friends and family that they never thought they could have before. And you play a part in creating that opportunity for your customers. So creating a mission orientation is the most important thing. Um, Beyond that, the research says that if employees feel connected to a couple other people at work, that's incredibly important to their motivation. So trying to create and foster and form and cultivate those connections to your manager and to other peers and colleagues is really important. I guess number three, people need to feel properly compensated. So that's why I've invested in companies like Syndio that focuses on pay equity and as a software solution to make sure that people are properly and fairly compensated. That's a very important part of motivation. Career development is very important. So you want to try to create transparency around career pathing to as great an extent as possible. That can be hard at startups, which are dynamic and career path can sometimes be sort of murky. But the more you can lay that out for people, the better. Um, uh, you want to teach employee empathy so that people communicate uh, empathetically with their employees. You want to create an environment where people can bring their whole self to work because increasingly that's what employees want, especially younger employees. They don't just view it as a job, they view it as a connection to. They're not as involved in their church anymore. They're not as involved in political parties. They're not going to YMCA meetings. Like they're seeking forms of connection through their company, which is different from past generations where people were involved civically with local community institutions and organizations. Increasingly, you have your work life and you have your personal life, and there's kind of nothing in between. And so people want to feel connection to some higher purpose and also to shared interests. This is why most companies I'm involved in have affinity groups where people can connect over whether it's cooking or religion or political activism or whatever is of interest to them at their company, the way you might have done that in college or in high school where you belong to a club. Well, companies now have clubs, which felt very weird 10 or so years ago when that first started happening. But now most major companies have affinity groups for all sorts of things. And that's an important way that we build connectivity between companies and employees.
Given that your experience leading culture, your interest in it, and the investments you've made in the HR tech space, are there any areas where you'd like to see more companies founded or a deeper investment? Where do you think there's still white space in HR tech?
Well, every company is struggling with this return to office thing. At first it was carrot. That was a couple years ago when the quarantines were lifted. It was how do we entice people back to our office? Then it became stick. Oh, you have to be there 3 days a week. You have to be there 4 days a week. Then it became kind of combination carrot and stick. And I think every company is still struggling with this. Pacaso has a couple hundred employees. We're entirely remote, no office at all. And that creates a lot of advantages, but around retention and engagement, but also some disadvantages around communication and also sometimes engagement. So I think if there are startups or software solutions to figure out how companies can have more engaged employees in this remote hybrid world, like that's a multi-billion dollar opportunity to be sure. And really nobody has cracked it from my perspective. There are a bunch of startups trying to do this in different pieces. And I'm an investor in several of them that have disaggregated certain aspects, like employee onboarding, or employee reviews, or employee benefits, like June, or interviewing, or pay and compensation and benefits. But stitching all this together and building a real operating system for a remote hybrid company, like that still hasn't really been done to my knowledge.
A lot of your most recent years has been, this transition back to LA and really investing in LA in terms of its community of entrepreneurs, of making it a hub for venture capital. What are your thoughts on LA and how it's evolved over the last few years, and what are you most excited about seeing it?
I'm really excited about LA Tech. I grew up here, and when I moved back about 6 or 7 years ago, I was blown away. I was gone for 20 something years. I was just blown away by the vibrancy of the LA Tech community. It has the intersection of media, entertainment, pop culture, tech. It's all here. And especially on the consumer side, because this is where creators, influencers, athletes, celebrities choose to live. This is where the whole world gets to figure out what's cool. Like that is decided by 10,000 or so people here in LA, whether it's fashion or sports or pop culture. Like that all happens here in Los Angeles. And then we have the convergence of the streaming services and the studios, and companies like Netflix, which is basically based in LA now, Disney, Hulu, Viacom, Max, like all of these things are here. We've got a long and rich history of space here and defense in the LA area. There are a lot of venture capitalists. And as you mentioned, I started dot.LA, which is a media and news business and events business to help call attention to all of this, to help be the water cooler for the LA tech community. And dot.LA is off to a really good start after a couple of years, but we have a long way to go to continue to tell stories of what's happening in LA tech. What am I most excited about here? Really everything. I mean, we've got HR tech companies like yours and like All Voices and many others. We've got Techstars. So we've got lots of early stage angels and pre-seed funds and early stage funds. And then we've got late stage. I guess what we haven't had enough of yet is the big tech IPOs. So Honey was a $4+ billion sale. Obviously we have Snap based here in LA, but there is this next cohort of Service Titan, of SpaceX, hopefully of Relativity Space, that will be multi-billion dollar. I mean, in the case of SpaceX, perhaps $100 billion plus company, Boring Company based here in LA, and others that will be really important for the ecosystem here. And of course, Seattle already has those companies like Expedia, Amazon, Microsoft, Zillow. And we need that generation to pass through here in LA, and it's coming. Like you can see it in the backlog, but we haven't quite gotten there just yet.
It's exciting stuff. Spencer, where can folks learn more about you? Where can they follow you? And any last words before we sign off today?
Sure. Yeah. You can find me at 75andsunny.vc. So 75andsunny.vc. You can also find me on all my social media, and on Twitter at Spencer Rascoff, LinkedIn, Spencer Rascoff, etc. And there you'll find my Libby, which is one of my new startups. So Libby is like link in bio, and so you'll see my Libby as my link in bio on all my socials, and you can chat with my AI or my Libby there and tell me or my AI about yourself and about your startup, and my Libby will summarize that conversation for me and schedule next steps and help me and help you. So thanks for having me, John, and appreciate what you're doing here to tell stories of startups and founders and other folks in the LA ecosystem and the tech ecosystem more generally. Thanks for having me.
Yes, thanks for being here, and hopefully see you soon at Milo and Olive, or Milo and Olive, whatever it's called.
See you around.
Thank you.